Guess it would help if I turned that on. Good afternoon, and welcome to this time of celebrating Jane Engle, who left this life on December 17th. Jane was a longtime friend of mine, and I'm very honored to be here with you all as we remember her and reflect on her life. To begin, David Lloyd from Seeker's Church will read us a poem in Jane's own words, which Ken found among her papers. It is called, Who Am I? Dave?
Jane wrote this in September of 2015 while in the Canadian Rockies. Who am I? Why am I? Those mountains far away from my touch, away from my wanderings, billions and billions of years old. I am 73, a transient life. Those mountains are forever. I am but their shadow. They will live longer. I am soon gone. I have this mental illness, so they say I don't belong. Billions of medications, more than the dirt in the mountains. Zoloft, Paxil, lithium, Cytomel, Wellbutrin, Luvox, Trazodone, Effexor, Gabapentin, Topomax, Seroquel, Iodone, Depakote, Lamictal, Adderall, Silaxa, Propanolol, Ativan, Clonazepam, and what have I forgotten? DBS, ECT, and more. Nonsense. Therapy for days and months and years. Is there any me left? Accept this ancient longing, older than the mountains, longing to belong, to fill the void, a family, to belong like the mountains. Who came before? Who will come after? Who will always be? To whom I can belong, to have roots, to have values and principles that have meaning, that have substance, that carry the best, not of abuse, abuse beyond the sexual, abuse of meaning. I must create meaning, otherwise, who am I? Why am I? I don't have those answers. Perhaps there are none. Perhaps it doesn't matter.
Jane's cousin, Katie Chang, will now read The Piece of Wild Things by Wendell Berry.
When despair grows in me and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and I'm free.
We come now to a time to reflect on Jane's life and remember how our relationship with her contributed to who each of us is today. In a moment, I'll offer a short guided meditation so each of us will have the opportunity to recall some particular way we were connected to Jane. Of course, each of us will remember Jane differently based on our own relationship with her. I invite you to begin by finding a comfortable way to sit. Fix your gaze somewhere in the room or close your eyes. Recall the first time you can remember seeing Jane. How long ago was that? How old were you? If you are not family, what brought you into each other's lives? What did Jane look like? Perhaps you knew Jane in the Civil Rights Movement. Did you work with her in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan? Or with her in the clinical AIDS research at NIH? Or maybe later when she was studying art at the Corcoran? Was Wesley Seminary part of your shared experience? Or perhaps Seeker's Church? Did you support Jane and be nourished by her in the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance? Did you cycle with her, hike with her, exercise with her at the Y? Did you volunteer together at the Audubon Naturalist Society or pray together? Were you on the Collington Grounds Committee or the Weed Warriors with her or somewhere else? Wherever you met Jane, what kind of clothes would she have been wearing? How did she fix her hair? What kind of eyeglasses was she wearing? Now that you can see Jane clearly when you first knew her, remember something that she was passionate about. Remember something that you shared in common. Cycling or hiking, identifying trees by their bark. Something else? Remember something that made Jane laugh. Remember something that made Jane cry. And was there something that got her dander up? Was there a special time that you remember sharing together? Was there a time you disagreed about something, or struggled together? Or a time when you might have pushed one another's buttons? These things often happen when we know someone for a long, long time. Now remember Jane in the way you would like her to have remembered you. If there is anything that you want to say to Jane, say it now in the quiet of your heart. If there is any unfinished business between you, any place that you wish her to forgive you, or that you need to forgive her, take this moment to ask for or offer that forgiveness in your heart. What would you like to thank Jane for? How would you finish the sentence? Thank you, Jane, for... Imagine what Jane most liked to do, and imagine her doing that right now. And if you are able, and the time feels right, tell her goodbye. And as you remember Jane and tell her goodbye, listen to this music for remembering. Now that we have said goodbye, each in our own way, Jane's nephew, Nick Frost, will offer some memories of Jane's life. Nick?
Good afternoon. On behalf of Ken and my family, I want to thank all you for being here. I'm Nick Frost, Jane's nephew. And I would like to share a few thoughts with you as we gather to celebrate Jane's life. First off, here's the hard part. I want to thank Ken. You're an amazing man. You truly, truly are. Jane was a strong and a passionate woman, but she was not always easy. Through it all, you supported her and helped her through so many tough times and so many battles. She loved you so much. I'd just like to say how honored I am to speak about my aunt today. I speak from the heart. Sorry. On behalf of my sisters, Christy, who's here today, my sister, Cindy, who can't be with us. She lives in Italy, but she did spend a great weekend with Ken about a week ago. And my mom, Jane's sister, Susan. My relation with Jane dates back about 30 years. But we really grew closer over the last 10 to 15. We would actually see each other only once every 2 or 3 years and probably communicated by phone with about the same frequency. This is how Jane liked it. This is how Jane wanted it. Ours was a relationship based around emails. Daily, weekly, hourly. It just varied. We emailed back and forth. We talked about everything. We talked about anything. I mention this because I stand here today amongst all of you, and the only familiar faces in the room are my wife Diane, my sister Christy, my mom Susan, her partner Delmar, and of course Ken. But I feel like I know so many of you because of Jane, because of emails. Jane was an extraordinary human being who had many interests, and whatever her interest or activity was at any given time, you could count on her to throw 100% of her energy into it. She was a biker. She was a hiker. She was a marathon runner. She was a swimmer. And back in the day, she was a pretty good tennis player. She was an artist, an activist, and a gardener. And it's already been mentioned, but I have to mention it again. I feel like I know the Weed Warriors if you're out there today. The pictures I got and the wounds from trying to get all these invasive plants that are around the grounds here and the videos, she loved that. And she loved to work hard. Jane was a lover of animals, especially Honey, her cat, who meant the world to her. And in her latter years, she could best be described as a lover of nature. Flowers, plants, shells, acorns, leaves, and of course trees. She would spend hours outside gathering leaves and acorns, and then she'd bring them inside. And then she'd organize them on the dining room table. And then she'd research all of them. And then she'd take notes. And they sat on that dining room table for days and weeks. Bless you, Ken, for being such a patient man. As all of these interests and activities were important to Jane, over the last 5 to 10 years, family became the most important thing in her life. She researched the Engle genealogy and has created a family tree through hundreds of hours of investigation. She's been able to connect with many of her relatives due to her work. As a result, there are many Engle family members here with us today. Jane has brought us together today. And I know she would be so happy to have so many family members in the same room. This isn't easy. My family has not met any of you, but we all look forward to getting a chance to meet with you, share stories, and learn about the Engle family connection. This is one of the legacies that Jane has left to all of us, and I think it's important for us to sustain this legacy. All right. Much of what I've spoken about much of what I've spoken about has been how many of you here today knew Jane and her more recent history. I want to share a little bit about Jane's past, as I feel it really helps to understand who Jane was at her core. Jane cared about people. Jane cared about right and wrong and justice. Jane wanted and did make a difference. I'm sure many of you don't know what she did in her lifetime, but because she was unwavering in her beliefs, I assure you she touched many lives. Jane stood up and marched for her belief in justice, equality, and personal freedom from the civil rights movement in the 60s, where she was one of 34 people arrested in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in the summer of 1963, to the women's rights movement and the human rights programs in Afghanistan, where she worked in the Peace Corps in the 70s. As a social worker and nurse, she worked in inner-city Chicago assisting the poor. As an ordained minister, she comforted AIDS patients in the 80s. As a friend, she supported and encouraged those closest to her. As my aunt, she inspired individualism, determination, and introspection. And as a human being, she courageously stood up to and coexisted with a debilitating disease that I think in the end she realized she couldn't overcome. Jane left an amazing legacy to the world and to me personally. And Jane was a wonderful lady. I will miss her very much. She was more than an aunt to me. She was a friend. I will miss our email conversations. And Aunt Jane, your memory will live on in my heart forever. I will miss you more than words can say. I'd like to close with an excerpt from an email that Jane sent some years back. I just came upon it the other day, and it just says a lot to me. These are Jane's words. This was from like a couple of years ago. And I was asking how she was doing. And me, swimming long and hard, and gardening until I can't stand up. It all helps to escape the depression that seems to be dogging me. Extremely hard work, the harder the better, helps me forget the dark thoughts. It was just at this time last year that I started to go downhill. It is coming around again. I've had shorter and smaller upheavals, but this feels like it's going to be a harder one to tame. I will. As I say when swimming that last lap and totally out of breath, you can do it, Jane. You can do it. Just do it. It works for me. I will get through it.
Ken has also prepared some remarks and his own memories and things that he wants us to know. Unfortunately, he's lost his voice this week, and so his voice will be Sue Reagan, who will read Ken's remarks.
Ken's words. Some of what I have to say may be hard for you to hear, and for that I apologize. Suicide is one of those topics that lurks beneath a social taboo. Most of us don't talk or think about it much. Although she never said so, I believe that Jane would be pleased that I am taking the opportunity created by her death to raise a bit the veil that shrouds this issue, this topic. Please know, too, that I have no professional expertise in this area, so that all I say is based directly on my experience walking with Jane through this valley. Shortly after Jane's death, my therapist remarked that while death is a natural phenomenon with which all of us have dealt at one time or another, and which will eventually end each of our lives, suicide is, by contrast, unnatural. I dare say that most of us present have not before now lost a family member or close friend to suicide. Although I am aware that the Engle family has suffered more in this way than is usual. It is very difficult for me to understand how Jane, or anyone else for that matter, will choose to voluntarily and by a conscious, intentional, and carefully planned act end his or her own life. Probably the reason this is difficult for me to understand is that I could not imagine doing so myself. So I'd like to share with you what I do understand about Jane's decision. I'm speaking very much from my head, from my intellect, when I say this. In my heart and my deepest feelings, I do not understand, and probably will never understand, why Jane would choose to leave me, her family, her friends, her dear cat, and the trees that she had come to love. Throughout her life, Jane was haunted by depression, which at midlife became bipolar disorder, for which she was hospitalized several times. As she moved into her mid-70s, the strenuous exercise, which had always been a tool for Jane in managing her depression, along with medication and talk therapy, became less possible because of various physical problems. During her last year, she had a TIA, a mini stroke, 3 attacks of angina, and arthritic issues. For all of these, she declined medical care. That declination was, of course, one more symptom of the depression. Her final days were spent struggling with a combination of emotional and physical pain, even as she maintained a close to normal schedule, including time with trees. Jane ended her life and the pain that had come to dominate it with a single gunshot to her temple while standing near her favorite tree and a small pond that she loved. Suicide appeared early in Jane's life. She told me more than once about setting her hair on fire as a child. Walter Blass, who was the Peace Corps country director in Afghanistan from 1966 to 68, reminds me that when Jane was serving in Herat, she had 7 bouts of amoebic dysentery, the last of which resulted in her evacuation to Bethesda Naval Hospital. Jane had told me about this, also mentioning that the disease progressed to encephalitis, and that the dysentery was caused by her intentionally drinking filthy local water with the intention of ending her life. But, as Walter also reminds me, 3 weeks later, Jane was in touch with him, wanting to resume her service in Afghanistan, which she subsequently did as a Peace Corps trainer in Kabul. This story, in addition to being rather amazing itself, is illustrative of a central tension of Jane's life. At various times, Jane was committed to serving others, to the arts, and to a vigorous style of living, even as all of this was mingled with depression, self-doubt, and suicide. I cannot leave Jane's life in the 1960s without mention of her participation in the civil rights movement. As an undergraduate at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Jane sat in at lunch counters to protest racial segregation. There are published pictures of Jane stretched out on the sidewalk, blocking the entrance to a voter registration site in Chapel Hill, where African Americans were systematically denied the right to register to vote. She was arrested for blocking the sidewalk, and until bond was posted for her, had a frightening encounter with the local police. You can see the photos on our remembrance table. Later, after she was trained as a nurse, Jane served in rural Mound Bayou, Mississippi, where she functioned as a nurse practitioner, although without that credential. None of us have the time and energy right now to hear about all of the life segments of this gifted, intense, and haunted woman, whom it was my privilege to love and be loved by. I am going to mention only now in passing Jane's engagement with Christian faith and the church which led both to her studying at Wesley Seminary and to a sexual abuse incident in which her claims against a clergyman were simply not believed. I must also mention that Jane's role in the National Capital Chapter of the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, where she served as a key leader and driving force, paying special attention to the issue of suicide. What I do want to say a bit more about is Jane's work as a visual artist, 3 examples of which are before you here in the auditorium. Jane worked primarily in acrylics on canvas and paper, and found her aesthetic grounding in the work of the abstract expressionists. The smallest of the 3, which Jane called Springfest, was the visual centerpiece of our wedding in 2002. For the piece done on 3 pieces of paper, Jane actually made the paper and added the acrylics at a crucial point as the paper was drying. The 3rd and largest piece won an award at a Corcoran student art exhibit, and I find it the most challenging to view. It is called simply Rage. Although not visible except under close examination, Jane intentionally cut the canvas at the top of the image as she was completing it. In what proved to be the final years of Jane's life, she developed a profound engagement with the natural world. For a while, her major focus was fungi. She delighted in photographing and identifying all manner of mushrooms. Throughout this last period, Jane was committed to native plants. Only these were permitted in her Collington garden. and she worked with the Collington Weed Warriors to eliminate invasive vines, which she saw as posing a long-term major threat to the trees on this campus. But Jane's greatest delight was in photographing and identifying trees and all the parts of trees. Jane left multiple notebooks filled with documentation about each of the tree families, including published material that she copied and her own photographs and comments. Under the increasing influence of the Depression, Jane retreated more and more from the relationships with people and groups that had previously nourished her, and became more and more emotionally engaged with her trees, telling me on several occasions that they truly loved her. Jane's life ended under her favorite cottonwood tree. Jane's life was a struggle between the life energy that all of us know and most of us find sustaining, and the near demonic power of major depression. That within this tension, Jane was able to live for 75 years such a productive, rich life is indeed her greatest tribute. I may never stop missing Jane, and I will always be grateful for the years that we shared. I will probably not get to speak to most of you individually, so I want now to thank you for your presence here today, your participation in this service, your patience with my many words, but most of all, for your love of Jane Engle, and for the memories of her that continue on as part of your life and the life of this community. Thank you. Ken Burton, January 20th.
As we continue to think about Jane and her life, Timothy Sabin from the Collington community will read In Blackwater Woods by Mary Oliver.
Look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds. And every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this. The fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it. And when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it. And when the time comes to let it go, to let it go.
We give thanks for the life of Jane Engle, for the gift of having known her and walked alongside her, and for her great love of the natural world. As we continue to carry Jane in our hearts, be assured that even in our sorrow, the life of each one of us remains precious and unique. Let us honor Jane's life by living with integrity and honesty, by treating one another with dignity, by seeing what is good in each person that we meet, and by caring for the natural world that Jane so loved. As we go from this place, let us bless one another in gratitude for all that is good, and may a deep sense of peace be with you always.